everyone, and thank you for joining the SC20 After Hours session, Proper Balance, the shared nuances of craft cocktails and exceptional storage. Hosted by Ellis Wilson, lead software architect at Panasas and cocktail enthusiast. I am Gabrielle Collier, Senior Director of Corporate Marketing at Panasas, and I will be your moderator today. We have an entertaining session for you in which Ellis will discuss the shared underpinnings of both a great cocktail and great storage architecture. We'll dig into the major categories of cocktails, discuss how balance plays a leading role in executing each type well, and then create one classic and one contemporary drink to breathe life into this theory. Throughout, Ellis will draw parallels to the importance of balance in the design of ActiveStor Ultra data storage. And while he is busy mixing drinks, we encourage you to submit your questions about cocktails or storage via the Q&A panel in your interface. And of course, we will share the cocktail recipes with you via email after the event. But before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. This session will be recorded and available on demand once SC20 concludes. For the best viewing experience, I recommend using a wired internet connection and closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background that could cause issues. These live sessions are bandwidth intensive, so closing any unnecessary browser tabs will help conserve your bandwidth. Also, please submit your questions through the Q&A panel located at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer all your questions during the session, but if a fuller answer is needed or if we run out of time, we will answer your questions later on via email. And now for those of you just joining us, welcome. We are about to start the SC20 After Hours session, Proper Balance, the shared nuances of craft cocktails and exceptional storage. And now it's cocktail time. Take it away, Ellis.
Thanks so much, Gabrielle. As mentioned, I'm Ellis. This is a bit of a weird SC20, but welcome to my bar, my home bar, all the same, in my basement. We'll try to keep this lighthearted. Usually I'll give an exhibitor forum on a deep dive on whatever technology we at Panasas are working on at that time, but this year I'm rather excited to do something a bit different and talk through, some of the key highlights of what makes a great cocktail and what makes great storage, at least in my opinion. So balance is the real fundamental that we're going to focus on throughout this talk. Executing on it is kind of at the heart of any great bartender's regime or recipe that a cocktail comes from, and at the heart of great storage, whether you're executing on a specific workload or whatever. Having the right hardware and software balance is super important and speaks to the quality of both the bartender or the storage. In cocktails, you can really break things down into three major groups, and they have different histories behind them, but this classification, if you will, comes from a book I have over here, Death & Co., but I think it's on the money as far as breaking the drinks into reasonable categories. So the first one and the eldest is the old-fashioned style. Sazeracs and old fashions and mint juleps are all kind of pretty good examples of that style of drink, followed by the Martini style, which goes a little beyond that. It's, early 20th century, started to show up in vogue as you got, better access to vermouth. Ice came on the scene, things like that, where it wasn't a major departure from old fashions, but still a really interesting style and different in its own right. And finally, the sour style, which I think is the one we are probably most familiar with, as it's both the sweetest, uses lots of citruses to create a brand new drink out of ingredients that you'll find in a martini, but it really just heightens it with additional sweetness and citrus flavors to make anything from a margarita to a daiquiri, all the things listed there in the examples. In computing, I think there are really three. You could probably segment it a couple different ways, but I think there are three main workloads that are hyper important in HPC. They were certainly at the top of our mind when we were designing ActiveStor Ultra. and they break down like this. So you have your old-fashioned style or batch large file size workloads. These tend to be throughput oriented. You see these in computational fluid dynamics. You see it in manufacturing. Lots of simulation codes that physics scientists will run, and so these are fairly predictable. We've seen these for decades, so we especially at Panasas, using a parallel file system, know how to do these extremely well, and so they were kind of the first on the scene as far as scale out storage went. The next one that came in was medium file size workloads that were really IOPS oriented. They could still be IOPS in larger file sizes, but the emphasis has really started to shift from just throughput to how many records could you put through your system in a given time for requests. And this came from CA and EDA, a bunch of different, biology goes across the entire workload spectrum, but some bioinformatics started to show up like that. And so that became interesting in the, early 2000s to, early even 2010s became something that we couldn't ignore and started to adapt Panifest to. And finally, what's always been there with home DERs, but certainly became much more moneyed and therefore interesting in the HPC space is interactive, mixed file size, really response-oriented workloads that show up in AI, certainly in M&E still, and then home DERs. So we had some exposure to them early on, being a parallel file system that people used for all their workloads. You still had to play nicely with the home directory usage while you had batch workloads going through your system. But those three categories is really how I like to classify the customer requests, if you will. The workloads are the thing you go up to the bar and you order, and how well a bartender can execute on those three is the big thing I'm going to talk about today. So I have one more slide, and then we'll actually get into making something. So let's talk about balance when it concerns an old-fashioned cocktail or a batch workload in HPC storage. So as you can see in the pie chart, the intent of an old-fashioned is really, it focuses around the strong, the base liqueur. Typically, this is some kind of whiskey. It could be, a gin or something else, but it really focused around whiskey when it was, originated in the 19th century. But the intent is really to raise and round. So you had, especially, in the Prohibition era, but even before that, some pretty rough spirits. You still have rough spirits today, although you can certainly get delicious whiskeys that don't require much adjustment. You really want to add complexity to what might be a somewhat basic liqueur, and then you also want to round it out. And so you can raise it by adding bitters or some kind of citrus, heightening the drink, and adding some, I would say it's like raising it and widening the entire flavor profile. And you round it with two things. You obviously add, sweetener to round something out. But what people don't always think is ice just isn't there for making something cold. It's also there to dilute it. And that's really important. If you taste like a base liquor on its own, I would definitely suggest adding 1 part water to it. And some people might object to this, but if you really want to smell the liquor to really appreciate it, that will reduce like the nose burn that you'd otherwise get and allow you to, sample a bunch of different whiskeys all in a row to find out, what actually shows up. And a small amount of dilution, whether that's via ice or just adding a little room temperature water, will really bring out the spirit. And so that's really what the old fashioned is all about. On the other side of the spectrum, you have your batch workloads. And the two keys to that are avoiding bottlenecks, making sure from the very bottom of whatever you're serving your data from all the way to the top through all the networking, CPU, et cetera, you have no real bottlenecks in the way. And maximizing the drive efficiency, which means not only avoiding bottlenecks, but making sure your software steps out of the way to really operate well. So on the bottleneck side, we've always done this well in Panifest. We certainly didn't kill off that legacy with ActiveStor Ultra, which I was fortunate enough to serve as lead architect on. We just refocused on the software. We were able to move out of kernel to user space just because of the changing times, which made it a lot easier to develop like effective and efficient software rapidly. And we streamlined that all the way down to those drives. Similarly, on the drive side, we were all about trying to squeeze as much out of every drive as we could because we recognized that as is the case in our storage system and is the case in every storage system, I would argue, your storage, the drives themselves, are the biggest component of the cost. So, if you have a vendor that's not squeezing 70, 80, 90% out of the drives, then they're basically failing their main mission when it comes to a bandwidth workload. And so we've achieved around 80% effectiveness, of the individual drive bandwidth, and we're really proud of that. The graph that you'll see, or rather the chart you'll see on the side, that basically has NVDIMM, DRAM, and hard drives that are highlighted because those are key to our batch workload. Those are going to be grayed out or colored in depending on if they're important to a workload. And the percentages there are basically just to highlight where does all the capacity come from in our storage. As you can see, we make really effective use of the extremely cheap hard drives compared to the SSDs, even with QLC SSDs. And that is just an important part to cost, which is at the fore of everyone's mind when you're buying HPC storage. So let me stop blathering on now and we'll actually make something fun. All right. So the first drink I picked out that is in the old-fashioned style is called a Fussfungal. And I picked it because it's, originates from Pittsburgh, which I live, you can't tell, but I'm in Pittsburgh now. And that's where Panasas was founded. It's a stirred old-fashioned. The ingredients are pretty simple. 2 ounces of rye. You could use bourbon, but rye is more classic in an old-fashioned. Then you use a 1/2 ounce of burnt brown sugar syrup. This syrup is basically made by combining, well, first you cook down brown sugar, dark brown sugar, in a dry pan until you get to almost a caramel. Add some boiling water, equal parts of it, and then you use half of whatever those parts were of molasses at the end. And that turns into a beautifully dark, almost looking like maple syrup, but a little bit thinner thing that you'll use instead of just using simple syrup in your cocktail. The other things, so I'm using Dad's hat here for my rye. It's pre-prohibition. That's about when this cocktail came about. So I thought that was appropriate. I'll try to get these things on screen. Ango, you really can't have an old fashioned without a decent house bitters. And then I'm going to be using an orange peel. You could use lemon peel, but I find orange a little more palatable in this. It's stirred, so the only tools, you can see basically all the tools you'll ever need in at least basic bartending, which is the level I'm at over here, and some ice. So we start by going in reverse order of the things I listed. You won't add ice first. I think that is probably the most important little trick I learned. It's really tempting to throw ice in there and then add your ingredients, but at that point you're in a race against time to try and populate your drink before it gets too watered down. So if you build it up first, add ice at the end, and then stir, you're able to really easily control, 40 revolutions seemed about right, or 60 revolutions seemed about right. So let's start. Bartenders tend to go in reverse order of the recipe listed just because, like in storage, despite Ango being quite expensive on its own, you're only using a really tiny amount. And that's why I think it's another cool parallel to ActiveStor Ultra, because while the NVDIMM and RAM at the top of our internal tiering, if you will, within an OSD is quite expensive, it's certainly not, by any means the most expensive piece of the system when you consider it in the aggregate. Most of the system is hard drives and SATA SSDs. So those are 2 nice dashes of that. Then we'll go on to the burnt brown sugar molasses syrup. And as mentioned, I'm going to do a 1/2 ounce here. The original recipe left out bitters, I think probably because they weren't super accessible at the time, and it used a full ounce of burnt brown sugar syrup. I found that to be a little too sweet, but if you certainly like a sweeter old-fashioned, feel free to use more. And then we will go with the rye. So 2 ounces of rye here. You could play around with it a little bit. It will get quite hot if you go to 3 or 3.5, but some people like it that way. So don't hesitate to mess with this if you find it to be a little too sweet for your taste. 1.5. Half. Okay. So a note on ice. Now we're getting really pedantic. So if you can, just get silicone trays. I thought I had one down here. I don't. I got mine from like Marshall's, super cheap, and get 1 by 1 inch ice cubes. I think they make for a more pleasant drink than your standard ones out of your freezer, simply because the shape is uniform, and the importance here is that you want to both be chilling and diluting and to be able to control both of those fairly well. So I'm going to shut up and stir because otherwise my drink will die. Gabriella, do we have any questions so far?
Yeah, actually, one came in. Somebody was wondering why some drinks are in the category of old-fashioned. Is there any history to that peculiar name?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And old-fashioned wasn't always old-fashioned, as you might imagine. It wasn't, you know, right when it came out in the mid-19th century, it was certainly new, and all people were trying to do is make, when you went into a bar, make something a little more palatable for people that didn't just want, you know, a shot of rye or a shot of moonshine or whatever. So it was only old-fashioned when, like, you got around to the 1870s or 80s, and people were used to, you know, the first didn't have ice. You know, mid-19th century, no ice. So, you know, late 19th century, you have ice, and people want ice, but they get kind of turned off by all of the curacao and syrups and everything else added to it. So they say, I want it old-fashioned. Just put sugar at the bottom and stir that with ice, maybe with some bitters. And so that was basically, you'd ask for the house cocktail or the house cocktail old-fashioned, and it just became a stylization of what was being served at the time. I personally don't like and don't endorse using just like sugar because it's going to make it very hard to dissolve. But you know, to each their own. Some people really like that little bit at the bottom. So the final thing I'm doing here in the cocktail is just basically rolling an orange, and if you want to go around the rim, you can toss it in. Let's give it a taste. Cheers, by the way. Hopefully everyone has a drink.
Cheers.
So if you can't remember, this is the Fuss Fungal. It is very drinkable. It's definitely like almost barrel or smoke forward. I think that's the molasses and the rye. This is a 4-year barreled rye whiskey, but it's definitely balanced against the sweetness. You know, it's not overly smoky or cloying. It's bitter, but it's not like taking my breath away, like gross bitter or anything. I think it really just adds depth to it, and I think, in fact, I occasionally like cigars. I think this is a fantastic drink with a cigar. I have not tried that combo yet, but I think this would stand up a little better than some of the lighter old fashions I've had in the past with a cigar. So nice. Let's move on to the next slide and then next cocktail. So let me make sure I can do this right. Share. Great. So the next style is the Martini Style, which is also a drink in itself, but it's the Martini or Manhattan style of cocktail. And basically the major difference that came about with this cocktail is that you had vermouth readily available and ice. And so you could, instead of just adding a sweetener to try and round out your cocktail, you could try, you know, adding other spirits such as a white wine or a vermouth to make it more palatable without making it too sweet. And so this kind of changed from a raisin round to a Bridgen round because some of the vermouths or white wines that were used really didn't agree with whatever your strong was, whatever your base was at the time. And so you have to find some commonality that make them kind of work together, but then bitters really serve as that kind of middle ground that kind of brought everything together. And so otherwise the rounding was much the same. You know, you didn't have a ton of sweetness, but you were using ice to really round things out, and the vermouth was used in a higher volume because it was, you know, it's alcoholic compared with the sweetener. So that was helpful in not like diluting the drink too much, but it also brought a lot to the party. You saw a lot more bitters come on the scene. Now, if you go to, especially New York City, there's whole shops just for bitters. But in this case, I'll be using I made my own bitters. That's the true cycle level. But while difficult, it's really interesting, and you get an appreciation for what goes into, all the hard that work goes into making bitters, which are basically your NVDIMs of the cocktail scene. On the IOPS workload side of the spectrum, that's kind of Martini's cousin in the storage arena. The interesting part here is that you really change what you focus on in the storage. Metadata, keeping up with the metadata transaction changes that are going on within your parallel file system or within your storage becomes like half the battle. It really is something that you fight to keep up with. And so, whereas on the last slide, it was a pretty simple, the NVDIM and the DRAM played an important part for making sure throughput was normalized across, bursts, and the hard drives were the major player. In IOPS workloads, you really want to focus on the entire stack. You have the NVDIM doing both staging of incoming data for like dirty data changes. It's also staging transaction log changes for the database that we're using that's housed on the NVMe SSD. The DRAM is providing a cache for clean data for that database and serving up clean, read data for the data side of the path. And then the SATA SSD and hard drive are basically splitting up, your workload into two separate types of files. And so that brings me to the second point, smart data placement. We did, from our ActiveStor 14 line, we started introducing SSDs back in the early 2010s. So we were one of the first parallel storage systems on the planet to really take SSD seriously. That hasn't changed. We just have slightly adapted how we deal with it now. So we focused on where we saw IOPS becoming a real problem for people, and what we found is on hard drives, just the larger files made the most sense to live there, and on the SSDs, it was quite the opposite. You really want to stash as many directories and small file data there as you can. And so what we did is we basically reevaluate what it means to be a small file every so often, and then move things between, migrate data between your SSD and your hard drives transparently within the ASU. So between those two things, we think we do a pretty good job on IOPS and ActiveStor Ultra. And that's kind of how our Martini was born, if you will. So let's pop out of this and actually make one.
Ellis, if you don't mind, I have a question that came in after this last slide.
Yeah.
So the question is, you're talking about ActiveStor Ultra having been architected around handling all three classifications of workloads well. Why is such a generalist approach superior to having three different specialized platforms for each workload?
That's a fantastic question. So in the case of ActiveStor Ultra, we had already seen the first two in our past product and ActiveStor Prime. And so we knew we were going to, at just the Panasas level, our architecture was already well set up for that. And so we knew that if we made subtle changes to the way we handled things internally in the OSDs, we could take care of the third area. So that's kind of the history from our side of the question. But from an external perspective, there's plenty of vendors that will differentiate their products and say, okay, here's our all flash tier, that's all NVMe. And then below that is our SATA SSD plus hard drive tier, and then it's going to go out to tape, or it's going to go to S3 or something else in the back end. That tiering approach is effective if you have hyper competent administrators and you have very predictable workloads. Or the other end of the spectrum, you only have a tiny amount of data and you just know you need to work on it really fast. So just buying an NVMe, a completely all-flash NVMe solution is going to solve it for you, and you don't really care about cost. We found that very few of our existing customers kind of fell into either of those buckets, and they're certainly not where the heritage of Panasas is kind of headed. We want something that remains easy to use. We want something that addresses as many of our customers' problems as possible without creating complexity on a day-to-day basis for the administrator. And we also recognize that most people can't guess exactly what workloads are going to come through their system. And even if they can that month or that year, what's next year? The storage is there for 3 or 5 years to really make it worth its weight in gold. And so if you can guess exactly what your workloads are going to look like in 3 years, then you're a better man than I or woman. So getting back to the drink real quick, we are going to make, as a classic example of the Martini style, something that's almost like a martini, but it's called a Gibson, because instead of olives, you're using cocktail onions. I chose the Gibson because our founder, Garth Gibson, was a huge influence on me. My second internship, but 3 years of interning was spent at Panasas, and so it just felt right to do this, which is rather close to a martini. You're going to be having a bit of orange bitters, the cocktail onion itself, Dolan white vermouth, dry vermouth. You'll notice I have a weird cap on top. This is just your normal, suction wine cap, Vacuvine, if you will, for the brand name. I keep mine fridged and vacuumed. I just treat it like white wine. I think that's the most effective way to make sure you don't add increasingly gross stuff to your martinis. But some people don't notice a giant change. It is a fortified vermouth, so you can probably get away with a little bit of room temp without a total travesty. And last, the Botanist. This is my favorite gin. It's super well-rounded, although like a bit bold on all the areas, if you really look at it in a real format. Really herbaceous, super botanical, pretty hot. It's just a fun gin. And I think it really, showcases well in something like this, which is a martini, or a Gibson or a martini class cocktail, where you really want to focus on the spirit still. So I'm going to rinse out some of these things real quick and we will get to it.
Hey, Ellis, while you're rinsing that out, somebody wants to know what's with that tiny barrel in the background there on your bar. Is there actually anything in it?
So there's not anything in it right now. It's become a bookend, but there's some fun things you can do with home barreling if you feel so inclined. That used to hold a Negroni, which is in the sour, arguably between the sour and the martini side of the spectrum. And then if you barrel it for like 6 weeks, especially in this size, it's just a 1 liter, you get a completely different tasting Negroni. It smooths out all the edges, and you can make it a little bit hotter as a result. So it's good fun. So we're going to build starting at the bitters. Again, smallest component first. Just 2 dashes. I'm using a dropper here, but a dropper is basically like a dash if you fill it up all the way. I like a bit more bitters. Many people just do 1 dash in their martini. And then a bit of, that burnt brown sugar did not want to come out. There we go. So I like a 7-to-1 ratio in a martini, or in this case, a Gibson. If you like more vermouth or less vermouth, you can go, in the latter case, 9-to-1. We're going 3.5 ounces of gin to 1/2 ounce of vermouth, hence the ratios I just mentioned. Now gin. And I don't think I mentioned why bartenders do in the reverse, but basically it's so that if you screw up, you're not throwing out 3.5 ounces of gin if you started with that and then added, more bitters than you wanted or whatever. All right. Clean up my bar, as it were. Leave these out. And ice. Again, we're going to do ice at the end so that I'm not in a rush. Well, I probably should be because I always run long on talks. So hopefully everyone's well lubricated. 40 to 60 revolutions. You can usually tell by the outside of the glass, but you can also tell by volume. I'm looking to add about 60–75% volume to this as I stir.
So there was another technical question, if you're inclined to answer it while you're stirring.
Sure.
So with the advent of even cheaper QLC NAND flash in production, why would one even bother with HDDs?
I kind of expected something like this. So the hard drives are dead. Calls have been coming in. since I started my PhD, at least in 2009. They're not yet. It's amazing, I know. But the interesting thing there is that, you know, we've been looking at QLC. We're experimenting with it in a prototype product we're working on. I can't talk about yet, but we're really excited about. It's effective at certain workloads, not effective at others, but it's still about 5 times more expensive than hard drives. So if you take the largest drives that we use in the ActiveStor Ultra and you compare it, you know, pound for pound against, or dollar for dollar rather, against even the QLC SSDs, you're looking at something between 3 to 3.5 cents per gigabyte versus around 15, 16 cents per gigabyte for the QLC. When you go to TLC, that jumps from that to 25 to 30 cents per gigabyte. And so, you know, a lot of our customers are both, they're bandwidth focused, they want everything, right? They want good bandwidth, they want really, really good, you know, dollar per terabyte. So while they want all the benefits of flash, they want them without paying 5 or 10 times more. So you know, looking at some projections we've gotten from some of the big players in the SSD space, well, I think things are getting better. The gap is not closed. And every time you add, you know, a big chunk of my PhD was just looking at some of the physics of flash, you know, NAND flash in particular. I don't see us being able to get to too many more levels than QLC. And so I'll be pleasantly surprised if we completely relegate hard drives to tape or out of this world anytime soon. But we'll see. The other part to that is, you know, the bandwidth you get out of a hard drive is still, especially when considering like SATA SSDs, which are at the like cheaper end of the spectrum for flash. The bandwidth you get out of a hard drive is about half of that from a SATA SSD, and so you can do a lot with spinning Rust still, and that will only close as they add multiple heads to it to get closer to the max for SATA 3 bandwidth. So we'll see, but we at Panasas have not yet given up on hard drives, and all of our customers so far have been thankful for it. So let's give this a spin. So I love one with olives or with a lemon rind, although my preference is olives, if I had to choose just between those two. This, I think, is just a crisper drink. It has, you know, all the botanical comes through. You get a little bit of vegetal flavor from the onion, I think, and the, you know, the brininess of that. You don't get any of the like oils you would get normally from an olive in that really strong flavor, which I think allows you to, you know, just appreciate the gin a little more, especially if you have a good gin on hand. The finish is really long too, which is one of the reasons I love a Gibson. You'll note I didn't have a poker in there to pull the thing out and eat it with, or even to hang it over the side. I love cocktail onions, but I don't love eating cocktail onions. So that ends up at the end of my glass at the end of the day. I've tried eating them before. It's intense. So you have to really love onions to enjoy that one. So let's jump back into our last set of slides where we'll talk about the third and final category of spirits and workloads that we're interested in today. So sours. Sours are the fun one, kind of came about in the 20th century, where you got access to lots of ice, citrus at a reasonable price. Sugar wasn't this like crazy, you know, difficult to find commodity anymore. And so you could mask a lot of things in a strong cocktail. And some people that were exclusively beer drinkers before kind of came into the fore as like, oh, this is approachable now. So the intents of it change as well. A sour is all about, you know, it's not as much about raising around because you have so much other volume in there that now you have to figure out how to complement it well and how to add the right amounts of the right things in there. You'll see you basically have a 2-1-1 ratio in that pie chart. That's super common across all cocktails. If you make a margarita, I insist on a, you know, 2 parts, 2-1-1 with tequila, some kind of, you know, Cointreau, and then your lime juice. I think that makes for a superior margarita, but you can adjust it if you like it sweeter or more tart. some bases just don't work together at all. And so finding the right combinations, even some of them that are not expected, is half the bartender's job, or recipe producer's job. And that just really adds, character and complexity to the drink. Then once you figured out what works together, finding out, how much to add of each thing is the last part, and fun sometimes if you want to experiment with friends and just figure out, what's each person's preference. On the other side, as mentioned, the sour is the newest of that bunch. I think like really response-oriented workloads are the newest of the bunch that have come to the fore with regard to storage in the 2010s and now into the 2020s. It's not just AI. People say AI, I think, is talked about a ton, but everybody kind of expects, as more and more flash gets added to all storage and even your laptops and everything else, people are used to, okay, let's go, responsiveness. And that is not only for interactive, more like home DER usage, but also application development has gotten a little more lax in terms of trying to pipeline everything appropriately. And so that stresses a storage system, and is something that we tried to deal with in development of ActiveStor Ultra. As you can see on the right side, all the layers, all the 5 layers in our layer cake are lit up. We use our NVDIM to basically stage in, again, metadata changes, but also data changes. Around 15/16 of it is just set aside for data changes. So really interactive, quick, on the fly, total overwrites or whatever of individual files will be stashed there for write back. And the DRAM will serve, all clean data up if it was like recently used for our hot tier. The NVMe, again, is being used exclusively for metadata. That consistency is what's most important. So we divide our data completely out to SATA SSDs and SATA hard drives, and our metadata exclusively to NVMe SSDs. And that, I think, gives us a real edge in terms of, compared to a lot of competitors, because we're really focusing on what the nature of the data is. In the metadata's case, that's basically something that should end up in a database, and we put it there, and we use the NVDIM to accelerate that database. And the data really should end up on either SATA SSD or hard drives, and we stash it there. In future products, we may reshake up this tier a little, this tiering a little bit, but I think the recipe is roughly correct, and we'll just need to adjust for balance as the integral components that come in kind of shift with the markets. So let me shut up and actually make a drink. So this one is called the Rosemary Ultra. It is a riff on a drink I got from Speakeasy, which is out of Employees Only in New York City. Nevertheless, I added my own little flair to it, and therefore I think it's reasonable for me to call it the Rosemary Ultra, but we did it in a little, building, office, building thing that we did years back, and we won in the office for that. I won't say I wasn't prepared, but it was a good time, and so I'm going to rinse up some of my utilities here, although I won't need to do as much because this is a shake and drink. So I think we're actually good with just that. So most sours you'll find are shaken. One of the things that differentiates shaken drinks from stirred drinks isn't just the motion or James Bond or something else. You're looking for a completely different texture in the drink. So shaking is going to add a ton more air into the drink and therefore create a different mouthfeel when you go to ingest it. The Martini, I really like it silky smooth. So you're only going to get that from stirring. Forget trying to bruise the juniper or anything else. That's not real. I don't believe in it. People say that happens to gin when you shake it. But certainly in the case of shaking sours, you're also trying to incorporate all of the different, the bits of lemon juice that we're using here throughout the drink. And that is most effectively achieved with shaking. So this is going to have lemon juice, maple syrup, again, Ango, rosemary, and the base is rye. I'm using a different rye here simply because Templeton rye is my favorite. It's super approachable, both price-wise and flavor-wise. It's a little less peppery than the Dad's Hat, and it's not as, while they're both like 4-year ryes, you can actually see that the Dad's Hat is just a touch darker. I think it just ends up either barreled in more charred barrels or just has slightly different components. This is just a nice cocktail rye. Sours, you have more volume in the other components, so that's what I would suggest. But if you have a cheaper rye,
Ellis,
go ahead.
oh, sorry. I do have another question that has come in.
For sure.
It's about the map you have there in the background.
Okay.
We think it's pretty cool, and we were wondering what the markers meant, because some of the holes are filled.
Yeah, this isn't an election map. This is simply I got this from my brother-in-law. You put beer caps in for your favorite beers, and I've been really choosy about what beers go in. And then someone played a joke and put a Michelob Ultra in Florida, which I haven't changed because, you know, at this point, it's funny. It's just funny at this point. But yeah, I'm a beer person as well as a cocktail person. As you can probably tell from some of the decals on the other side. A 4-tap system in the other room, and so this isn't about beer. That's a different after hours Panasas special. So I'll let that gentleman speak to beer at that one. But yeah, that's just a beer cap thing. And maybe by the time I'm like 70, I'll have filled in all the holes. But I'll continue to be choosy until then.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. So we added 2 dashes of Ango. We're going to follow up with, again, going in roughly opposite order, which I'm doing backwards now. The maple syrup is next. 3/4 of an ounce of maple syrup. Any kind can do, although I would suggest using real maple syrup, where you might get just, you know, corn, like roast flavor to it. It doesn't even need to be good maple syrup, like, you know, quality, but it can even be like grade B or whatever. That tends to be more flavorful anyhow. This is freshly squeezed lemon juice. The stuff that comes in bottles, I really wish they could make it good, because it sucks squeezing a bunch of citruses, especially for a party, but do yourself a favor and just do it, because nobody that I've found does it right yet. 1.5 ounces of that. And finally the rye. And this is 3 ounces. One thing I mentioned before I start shaking and no one can hear me, you know, in the sour cocktail that has like probably the most, I don't want to say complexity to it because that's not fair to the other styles, but certainly has the most ingredients that you'll find going into it. I think that best parallels increasingly complex either storage tiers if you're doing external to the storage, or in the case of Ultra, you know, as we added more and more tiers to deal with all these different workloads. I think, you know, my comment about rye is really applicable here. You don't need the most expensive base component if you're using the most of it volume-wise, because it's going to be hidden by the other things. And I think we hide latency in storage. We, you know, try to deal with bursts and lulls in the bandwidth side of storage. So I think there's a lot of parallels here, but maybe I've just had too many cocktails. So, oh, and one bit of rosemary. I'm skipping a step. It can just be like a tiny piece that's left over from cutting it to size for your glass. This will infuse the rosemary way better than just adding it at the end as an aromatic. And I'm going to again use like 3 to 5 ice cubes. I tend to just look as I add them. I definitely want it to be over the liquid that's in there, because I'm going to be adding volume by diluting. Yeah, we'll stick with 4 here. And then shake. People get really fancy about shaking. I don't think you have to get too crazy if you're using decent ice cubes. If you're using just the ones out of your freezer that are like the more like semicircle ones, they will break up easier. So just try to like swirl it a little bit gently to temper your ice, or you're going to get tons of little ice chunks. Some people like that, but it will dilute your drink a lot faster. So. Rocks glass. I like a big cube for this. You could arguably go small cubes, but a 2-inch big cube is just nice. It fits well. Garnish with a little rosemary and strain it. If you wanted this to be clearer, you could double strain it using just like your typical kitchen sieves. I like all the chunks, all the lemon chunks and whatnot. So let's give it a spin. So right out of the gates, it's like holidays in the Caribbean. It's really, the rosemary's in your face, but it's followed up quickly by, you know, the lemony and sweet, but not gross sweet, you know, just maple syrup, luxurious sweetener that goes into it. And so, yeah, this is just keeps, every time I like find something new with this drink, and I've made this like a dozen times at this point.
Yeah, and I can actually confirm this. I made this Ellis recipe drink at my last New Year's Eve party, where I had set up a bunch of different drink options, and that is the one that everybody wanted more than one of. So it's a good one.
That it worked out.
And if you have a sec, I have one more question, if you don't mind, if you can fit it in. So there was a question about, won't your system fall over if you have so many small files on your SSDs? Wouldn't you risk running out of space?
Another great question. That's certainly a concern. So when we started to divide up, you know, once you start getting real layer cake with your storage system, you have to really pay attention to what's stored in each layer, and how, especially pathological workloads, can kind of impact each of those layers. So what we do is, you know, this relates to the proper placement, or the thing that the thing I talked about on a past slide. We put small files on one, you know, on the SATA SSDs, large files on the hard drives, serve them from both of those. But what small is changes with the system. So what we do is, in the background, we'll walk through, we really take our time with it to not impact foreground performance, but we'll walk through the object space local to the OSD, and then decide, you know, given that, let's bucketize it and let's make good estimates about how many of these can we fit on the SATA SSD to make sure that we're not filling it too tightly, but also try to make the best use of it as we can. And I think this is one of the really unique, you know, the different differentiator between internal and external tiering. So with internal tiering, it's cheap to move something from one SATA device to another, or NVMe to SATA, or anything else, because you're just going in intra-node. As soon as you start going out to a network, out of a node, moving it to another device, you have all kinds of consistency issues. You have major bandwidth bottlenecks. You know, even SATA to SATA, you can move stuff very quickly. And so, you know, migrating in intranode within the ASU is something that we really focused on as like a must-have for Ultra, to make sure that we didn't run into that exact problem, because you would start to see slow accesses if your small files were no longer located on the hard, or on the SSD, because they'd spilled over to the hard drive. So that's a great question, but certainly something we thought about for Ultra, and hopefully executed on well. So one thing I was going to mention before I close out is, you'll see there's like a white layer on this, and that is something, anytime you shake with a citrus, you're going to get a foam. You're going to want to foam unless you double strain. I think it's gorgeous. I think it tastes awesome. Totally changes the mouthfeel of the drink. But if you don't like it, then feel free to just double strain, and you should be okay. So for the last set of slides, and then I will take any additional questions. I'm going to just, you know, close out with a stairway to a great cocktail or storage. So we talked all about balance, so I won't rehash that. Execution on that balance is, you know, the thing that takes a technique from just, you know, a theory or vaporware, or, you know, a recipe that nobody makes, to reality. In cocktails, we talked all about, you know, the right tools, the right size ice, maintaining your ingredients, how do you shake and stir, and how long, and whatever. In storage, you know, it's the right melange of hardware and software together, but done in an intelligent fashion. And really focusing on, you know, this is something Panasas has always done, and I've always been really proud about, is really focusing on real world workloads, the things our customers care about, cost of ownership, and fully utilizing your hardware. You know, we're not focused on some artificial benchmark or something else. It's really about the things that our customers care about. And finally, getting creative, you know, extending cocktails that you know and love with novel additions, whether you're switching one thing out for something else that you think might work well, or adding something else into an existing recipe that already works well. Understanding the foundations of balance allows you to really mess with cocktails in new and appreciative ways. We apply that same out-of-the-box thinking to our storage design. Panasas has a really solid intellectual foundation. That's why I named the second drink, or chose the second drink rather, after Garth. To handle emerging workloads. I'm certain that AI is not the last cool, sexy workload that we're going to have to adapt to, but I'm confident with the brains at Panasas that we're going to be able to do that well, and we'll do it in a creative way. So those are all the slides I had, so I'll be glad to take any additional questions if there are some. And I'll switch back to the Gibson, since that was my favorite so far, at least for tonight.
Yes, so here's my call to the audience. Please submit some more questions. Anything you can think of, go ahead, use your Q&A button and submit away. And I have a personal question. I was wondering if you had to pick, what is your favorite cocktail, Ellis?
Okay. Oh, hardest question yet. I'm gonna pick two. That's cheating, I know, but it's hard. Okay. So the first one I've had and I've never been able to reproduce. And the other one I made from the Speakeasy book I mentioned from Employees Only in New York City. It's fantastic. So the first one I couldn't reproduce, I had in Smuggler's Cove, which is in San Francisco, and is a really cool tiki bar, multi-level tiki bar, really tight spaces, not super loud music, but very like Hawaiian or tiki themed music, and amazing cocktails. Like I'm good with lots of spirits. Rum eludes me a little bit. And so they served a Captain's Grog there. And grog is a pretty classic tiki drink, but Captain's Grog was like that on steroids. And it just super impressed me. I couldn't probably have more than two of them, but it was an amazing drink. The one I made, because I have the recipe, and it's really good and just changes, it adds layer upon layer to a sour. And the thing I mentioned about creativity in the last slide is a New York sour. And you can get this pretty frequently in New York City, but it's basically a bourbon sour, so lemon juice, bourbon, some kind of sweetener, whether that's maple syrup or just simple syrup or something similar to that, bitters. And then what you do is you take a spoon, basically put it like this, which you'll use to float anything over top of a drink, and you put like a Malbec or some other red wine on it. And that float on top was transformative to me. I was like, this is going to taste terrible. But it worked. And I don't know why. I still don't fully understand the drink, but every time I have it, it's without question one of the most complex drinks I put together. It's pretty simple to do at home. Just a shaker, ice, the ingredients I mentioned, and then some kind of wine to put over top. You don't even add much wine, but just sipping through the drier red wine to the really sweet drink, not even really sweet, but sweet and bourbony drink underneath somehow works. And that's what's so unique about both cocktails and storage is if I came to you and you had a glass of red wine in your hand, I said, oh, just add lemon juice to that. I think everyone would reasonably say no. And same if you had a shot of bourbon in your hand, and I just added simple syrup to it, it would be gross. And I think, some of the dialogue that's going on in storage is unfortunate because it's almost overly simplistic. It's well, all you need is this, or all you need is that, or maybe just these two things. And I really think to make a good cocktail or to make a great storage architecture, you need a little more than that, and you need to do the legwork to make them all work together. And that's something that the New York Sour certainly accomplished for me. And if you Google it, you can even find many implementations of it. But if you look for employees only New York Sour, I think that one is just out of this world. So those would be my two favorite. I know that was long-winded, but.
Well, thank you so much, Ellis. I don't see any more questions from the audience. So I would like to thank you for taking us through this fantastic cocktail hour. I certainly enjoyed it.
Looks like we got one question. What is your favorite storage? Okay.
Oh, okay.
So I'm biased. I've been at Panasas since 2014. So I haven't worked for, DDN or WECA or anybody else, nor really, well, I have Panasas storage in my home. I don't have any other storage besides home storage. So I can't answer that honestly. So I would encourage you to ask your, fellow compatriots in whatever area you work in. But for sure, mine, especially with Ultra, again, biased because I was able to lead the charge on that one. Mine is definitely Panasas. And I think that what we'll bring to bear beyond Ultra in 2021 is going to be really exciting. And I'll probably be even more biased at that time. So, I'm sorry.
Well, with that, you're good?
Yeah, I'm all good.
All right, excellent. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us today. We will send you a link to the on-demand version of this session, and we will of course include the cocktail recipes so you can get carried away at home. And right now, I wish everybody a great evening, and thank you again for joining us. Bye for now.
Thanks a lot. I'll see everybody. Bye.
Bye.